Well, let's go into the history. First of all, the standard accepted history written by economists of how money came to be, and you describe in your book how there's an accepted myth that first came bartering, then came the invention of currency, then came credit, if you will. And you and other anthropologists have said that there's really no evidence for this?
Zero. This has been kind of a pet peeve of anthropologists for at least 100 years. Adam Smith made up this story, in 1776, actually, when he wrote Wealth of Nations. He was just speculating what must have happened to lead to money. And he said, well, I imagine that people would just swap things with each other. And I would say, I need a cow. Tell you what, I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow. Okay, how about 30? And you negotiate, come to a deal. And problem is that, if they don't happen to need chickens, you don't have anything else they want, no deal. So you kind of have to invent something to use as a medium of exchange. This is the standard line. And everybody learns this in one way or another. Just the other day I was, chatting with the airport security guy as he was scanning me about my book, and I said, it's about the first 1,000 years. And he was like, 5,000 years? I assume they would all be using barter back then. Everybody has this in their head. The problem is, anthropologists have been going through the world pretty much everywhere for the last 100 years trying to find some place where they do that, and they just don't exist.
You're saying that barter doesn't exist as adopted in a society?
Within societies. I mean, people will do barter with strangers. If there's somebody you're never going to meet again, well, you kind of got to swap things. But if it's people that are your neighbors, which is the original scenario, if it's people you're in any kind of regular contact with, or even really if it's regular trade, people don't do that. And if you think about it for a moment, it's kind of obvious why they wouldn't, because what the standard story assumes is that people will deal with their neighbors in what economists call the spot trade. I give you something, you give me something, we walk away, and if we can't settle the deal right now, that's it. Well, that's silly, because even imagining the sort of 20 chickens for the cow scenario and the guy doesn't need chickens, well, I'm his neighbor. I'm going to have something he wants at some point, and it's nice to have neighbors in your debt. In fact, what you actually observe in most communities where people are, people of relatively equal status who are neighbors, are coming to some sort of arrangement with each other about stuff. For example, it's often the case that if you just praise an object that belongs to someone else, they kind of have to give it to you. So what would really happen is you go up and you say, wow, that's a beautiful cow, and there's really no appropriate response. There's nothing you can say other than, oh, well, it's not much, but take it, please. You're my neighbor, I love you. Don't even think about giving me something back. But of course, we all know now I owe him one. So what you get is a sort of credit and debt situation, but it's not a specific one where you can quantify exactly how many of one thing equals another. Usually you have a sort of rank of sorts of things. A cow is roughly the same as a canoe, is the same as a jade necklace, is the same. Second rank, third rank, fourth rank types of objects. Or you could, it's not necessarily an object, too. It could be a favor. You need help with something. It's good to have people in your debt. So what they're making up, these economists, is a story which imagines that essentially social relations don't exist, that people are only thinking about the stuff, which is fine if you're inventing economics, which is the study of people who are only thinking about the stuff, but that's not how actual people normally behave.
So is there evidence that whole societies behaved on credit and lending and borrowing, items and keeping tabs, if you will, before currency existed?
Absolutely. That is what all evidence tends to indicate. I should make a distinction here. The scenario I was just alluding to is more a case of nobody's tabulating anything. There's sort of a vague sense of, I owe you sort of like that, I owe you sort of like this. The question is how it becomes quantified. And oddly enough, all evidence we have indicates that it's legal systems where that starts to happen, when you have to pay fines, because that's the situation where people are in no mood to compromise. Somebody's eye gets poked out, it'll be like 27 heifers for an eye, or, this means war. And if you don't have heifers, you actually do have to figure out how to substitute. So in situations like that, where there's a potential for violence, where people are in a very uncompromising situation, that's precisely when they start counting things and demanding exact equivalence. There's other ways that money crops up. It seems that the first forms of money in Mesopotamia had to do with people who had to, they had these very complex temple complexes with thousands of people working for them, often widows and orphans at first, and after war they start bringing in captives. But they have to allocate materials within these bureaucratic complexes, which aren't actually states, they're autonomous. They run themselves, but there's people doing fishing, there's people doing pastoralism, there's people growing things, there's people making things, they have these little factories, and they have to distribute stuff and calculate rations and equivalents, so they make up a system where everything is equivalent to a certain amount of silver. And that markets kind of develop on the side of that, where people start using those systems. But the interesting thing about ancient Mesopotamia, for example, is that they don't seem to have been actually using the silver to buy stuff. In fact, sort of real giveaway, is they didn't make scales accurate enough to weigh the very, very tiny bits of silver that would have been required to buy, a hammer, a chair, a shirt, something like that, even though it seems that people were, after a while, buying them. So everything was put on the tab.
So gold and silver have at various points in human history been considered currency or equivalent to currency, being able to measure something in the form of a metal that doesn't corrode. How does that figure into the history of currency and money in the U.S.?
In the U.S.?
I'm sorry, worldwide.
Worldwide. Okay. Well, at first they mainly just kept the gold and silver stockpiled and used it as the basis of credit transactions. Egypt tended more toward the gold, Mesopotamia toward the silver. Merchants, very rich people would occasionally actually show up with the stuff. Or sometimes you'd bring it in at the end of the year. So you'd run up a tab and with your local merchant, and then every 6 months to a year, you just sort of show up with something either denominated in silver, if you had some silver, actual silver. But again, they weren't stamping the silver in uniform bits. You just have to weigh it out. So that's what you have at first.